The topic is one that, I think is an important one. Most of the people we address only want to know three things. Who is this guy, and what's he going to say, and when's he going to be over? And so I'd like, if I may, to set a tone a little better than that with what Social Security is about by quoting something that I've dug up out of history from Patrick Henry. This happened back in 1775 when he was facing tenuous times as we are. And he said, quote, "It is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren until she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it." Well, that is what Social Security is, what we're talking about here. I basically want to break this up into a couple of pieces. I want to do the history on it very, very quickly, and then raise some interesting questions, I think, about the morality of transferring funds from people who have earned it to other people who have not. I want to talk about the legality of it under the Constitution, see if we can find some words of wisdom there. And then I want to talk about some of the proposed solutions to the problem, or non-solutions, as the case may be, both the major and the minor ones, and who is behind them, and so on. And then finally, what, if this is the wrong direction to be heading, can we take advantage, perhaps, of some changes in the attitude of the American people, and can we apply pressure in some way to our elected representatives to stop doing certain things in a certain way, and stop looking at certain things in a certain way, and maybe change how they would look, and maybe no longer consider the Social Security issue as a hot potato and too hot to handle, and something that we want to sort of Band-Aid over. I know that Band-Aid isn't a verb, but that's what's being used in Congress to solve some of these problems. And kind of, if it isn't a direction we're going, how can we make any influence in it? The history of Social Security is interesting. It was actually a law passed by the House and the Senate, and then signed into law by Franklin D. Roosevelt in August of 1935. However, no taxes were taken out of anybody's check until after the presidential election of 1936. The irony of that, of course, escapes very few people. The first draft against checks was made back in January of 1937 at the rate of 1% of covered payroll up to a total of $3,000 a year, or a total of $30, a very innocuous amount. Actually, it was to be matched by employers in an equal amount, and those of us here tonight who are employers know darn well that it isn't 1% of $3,000, but 2%. 1% merely being deducted directly, and the other percent being paid indirectly through higher prices in the marketplace. And that's what happened. The first benefits really weren't paid until the early part of 1940, late part of 1939, early part of 1940. And the very first beneficiary of Social Security is a lady that gathered some fame unto herself. Her name was Ida Fuller. She was a legal secretary and paid a total of $22 out of her own check into Social Security while she was working. She retired in the middle of 1940 and started a retirement benefit, a small one, and by the time she died in 1975 had collected a little more than $20,000. Now, I am an investment advisor, and I must tell you that that is a good rate of return. In fact, it is so good that it's almost too good to believe, and maybe it raises the question, and I'd like to raise that along the way, of is this in fact an actuarially sound insurance type of system as it was sold to the American people at the time, or is it a chain letter? Is it a pyramid scheme? Is it a Ponzi scheme? And that raises some interesting questions, and I have some quotes from Mr. Ponzi himself regarding the efficacies of a chain letter, because he had, of course, an intimate knowledge of that just before he was deported. Well, the system operated in fairly good shape. It was never actuarially sound, but it never ran into trouble until 1976. By that time, several things had happened. One is that Congress had taken advantage of the, quote, surplus in the account, the fact that the account was actually receiving more money, the retirement trust fund, if you want to, was receiving more money than it was paying out. As I said before, it was never actuarially sound, but there was a, quote, profit in it from the point of view of congressmen who wouldn't understand the finer things of contracts and mortality rates and expected morbidity and so on. And so from 1960, every 2 years through 1972, benefits were increased really without much concern about how to pay for them. By 1972, the benefits were then indexed to Social Security, and a number of underlying assumptions in the program began to get out of whack. Interestingly, the man who created the system, Robert Myers, an actuary, has said that it was never to be actuarially sound. He said that it was basically a pay-as-you-go system, and he was only hired to make sure that it would, in fact, be that much. He is still alive, by the way, an interesting man. He's now in retirement. He has been asked to come back to Washington, to come back out of retirement and try to help keep this thing together, and so his comments are especially useful. Well, by 1976, the system was in deep trouble, and at that point, the Carter administration, after some hearings, decided that what we needed was a tax increase, and so they made it a dandy. I suppose if you're going to go to the public till, you might as well go big. And it was the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history, $227 billion over the next 10 years. And Carter said, quote, "This legislation will guarantee that from 1980 to the year 2030, the Social Security funds will be sound." So much for the guarantee of politicians. It took the trustees only 30 months after that period of time to discover, in fact, that the system was going to be broke. We had simply expanded the system to its natural limit, that is to say, the limit of the population of the United States. The only people that are or can be excluded are the Amish, if they opt out, and anybody that is a minister of a recognized church. All the rest of us get to contribute to the system. Well, at that point, the OASD trustees had discovered by actually just this summer, after doing an analysis of it, by the way, the OASDI stands for Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance. The trustees have said, the way things are going, the retirement fund, the big one, is going to be out of money by November of 1982. Robert Myers thinks that's far too optimistic. And he is saying that, in fact, it's going to be out of money by Christmas. Merry Christmas to 34 million Americans who have been accustomed to receiving checks on a regular basis. Well, we see things like this in the paper, and I know that you have seen these. You can scarcely pick up a paper anymore without something on Social Security, and these are the increases. Of course, this is now the 1982 step-up in wage base and in percentage that Mr. Carter had put in 1977. The wage base has increased slightly since 1937, from the $3,000 up to a little over $30,000. In 1982, it'll be $32,400, as a matter of fact. And the percentage being taken out has gone from 1% to 6.7%. To put that in real dollars, the average contribution of a covered payroll contributor back in 1937 was $30, and it'll be just a little over $2,000. And matching that with his employer's contribution, we're looking at about $4,400. By 1990, we will all be contributing to the system about $10,200 a year. And that's the system, with those tax increases still going to be broke, according to both the trustees and Robert Myers. Well, I'd like to talk about this for a second. What is this system? Was it insurance? How was it set up? I commend this book to you if you can find a copy. It's called Social Security, The Fraud in Your Future, and it was printed in 1975. It's the collection of some articles that Warren Shore, a research investigative writer, prepared for a couple of Chicago newspapers in 1974. And he dug up, very interestingly, a very simple paragraph out of something called Your Social Security, published by the Social Security Administration. Quote, "The basic idea of Social Security is a simple one. During the working years, employees, their employers, and self-employed people pay Social Security contributions, which are pooled in special trust funds." I especially like the use of the semantics here. The contributions reminds me of a man who had claimed on his 1040 that he had contributed $600 to his church, and the IRS was questioning his tax return, and the agent called the minister of the church and said, "We are doing an audit of Brother Williams' return, and we'd like to verify with you that he, in fact, did make to you the contribution of $600 that he claimed that he did. Can you verify that for us?" And the minister said, "Well, no, I can't do that. I don't have this information here in the office. I'll have to get back to you with you on it. But I can assure you of this, sir, that if he didn't, he will." You see, so this ain't a contribution. You see, this here is called a tax. But it's made to sound somehow like it was an insurance policy, and these referring to special trust funds, pooled in special trust funds. The trust funds have never really had any substantial amount of money in them, and in fact today the funds have about 60 days worth of money in them. It's merely a transfer point from the incoming money to the outgoing checks, and that's all. This idea somehow that it's insurance, OASDI, the Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance, the contribution on our checks, FICA, Federal Insurance Contributions Act, it's just plain fraudulent. And so Warren Shore is right, by the way. If you look up the definition of the word fraud, that means deceit or trickery deliberately used to fool. And that's, of course, what happened at the time. It was never meant to be actuarially sound. And so that really kind of brings you up to date, all of us up to date on the system as it is today. What is the morality of the system? When we now know, certainly, that the money that you and I are contributing into the system is then simply recast in the form of benefit checks out to the lady in green tennis shoes in Paducah, 84-year-old grandmother who's been receiving her check regularly for the last 20 years. What is the morality of that? Well, the best way to approach that, I think, is to quote a very small piece of a very interesting letter written by a Dr. Pruitt. And this is a doctor in Wichita, Kansas, a number of years ago, got in an argument over socialism and Social Security, and he got in an argument with some very close friends of his, apparently, and they got mad because he had accused them of certain philosophical differences, and they had taken offense, personal offense, to his position. And he wrote them a letter fundamentally saying, you know, I love you and I care for you and I don't want you to be mad at me, but here's my position. And the letter is so well done. It's called, by the way, now, A Rift Between Friends in the War of Ideas. And I'd like to read a section of it to you because it spells out the moral question about as clearly as I've ever seen anywhere. He said, some years ago, George, you gave me the clue through which I have finally solved, at least to my own satisfaction, this dilemma. You were discussing and defending Social Security. You told me the story of a man whom you had known for many years, a good, honest man, hard-working, loyal, undemanding, who for one reason or another had never been able to save anything for his old age. You felt that he and the millions like him deserved something better than a beggar's existence in their old age, and you wanted to help him. The story stuck with me. I knew that the answer to my question was in this story if I could only find it. Not too long ago, I was reading something written back in the late 20s or the early 30s by that socialist Norman Thomas. He said, in effect, the American people will never accept socialism as a system as long as it is called socialism. But they will buy it entirely if you disguise it and call it humanitarianism. And I read this and I remembered your story, and suddenly I understood you and Martha, George, and most of the millions of others, including myself. He said, let me say with honest and respectful candor that it was your great capacity for compassion which betrayed you, and which finally allowed you to be persuaded that it was right and proper to use organized force and coercion to make that group of people save money, who, for whatever reason, either could not or would not save of their own volition. Once that decision was made, once that bridge was crossed, then other decisions and other actions involving your interpretation of what was the good of social groups and the use of legal force to dispense it became easier and easier. You did it for the most sincere and seemingly noblest of reasons, humanitarianism. But when you bypassed the individual and embraced legislation and force as a means of doing good for this group or that, you became, however unwittingly, a socialist. Well, it's spelled out very well in a book written actually about 100 years ago, 125 years ago, a man who was actually in the process of trying to explain what the proper function of government really is. He wrote a book called The Law, Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And this is the most marvelous, brief presentation that I've ever seen. And in here, he predicts the Social Security Administration. He was talking about legal plunder. He said, how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. Then abolish this law without delay, for it is not only evil itself, but also a fertile source for further evils. The person who profits from this law will complain bitterly, defending his acquired rights. Do not listen to the sophistry by vested interests. The acceptance of these arguments would build legal plunder into a whole system. In fact, this has already occurred. The present-day delusion is an attempt to enrich everyone at the expense of everyone else. What is the story as far as the Constitution is concerned? Where in here does it provide for the Social Security Administration? This is a copy of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Where does it say anything in here? Well, it doesn't say anything. And so by definition, it's illegal. Now, that's an astonishing position to have some people believe in, because they somehow believe that somehow the Constitution is to provide and to through the general welfare clause and not basically to protect. And yet, if we look at the 10 Amendments and the impact, by the way, that George Mason had on the creation of the 10 Amendments, is a fascinating story all by itself. They were further limitations placed upon government. The Constitution, occasionally we hear the liberal cliche that it was created for an agrarian society, that somehow things have changed over the past 200 years, and so it's not relevant, you see, it's not on point. Well, it wasn't designed for an agrarian society, it was designed for politicians. And I don't know that they've improved all that much over the last 200 years. Basically, the document is a restriction on government, both state and federal, and certain things are allowed, but basically, by and large, most of the things are no. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Why, we're enjoying the First Amendment right peaceably to assemble, right here tonight. The Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house, etc. And it goes all the way down through the 10 Amendments. The government can't do this, and the government can't do that. The government can't do this, and the government can't do that. And the 10th Amendment says, and if we forgot anything, they can't do that either. That's what it says. It says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Why all the restrictions? Why all the limitations? And we could spend probably an hour on that topic alone. Suffice it to say that this was Jefferson's answer to that question when posed it by a friend who asked, "Have you no faith in the men we elect? Have you no confidence in our government?" Remember his marvelous response. Jefferson said, "Confidence is everywhere the parents of despotism." So in questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Well, has this thing ever been challenged in court? The answer is yes. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court never mentioned any of the 10 Amendments, in the opinion. Never mentioned the 10th Amendment, but talked about the General Welfare Clause, and somehow you got the idea that the end of providing money was so important that the means to get there were of little consequence. And of course, that is the essence of the breakdown of morality, where the end justifies the means. And of course, it leads us into an amoral whirlpool. The Supreme Court at that point appeared, in my opinion, to simply ignore the limitations of the Constitution and appeared to arrogate unto itself the power to determine what the Constitution was going to say or not say, when in actual fact, the Supreme Court is what the Constitution says it is, and not the other way around. And this is what this whole business is meant about being this country being a government, our government being a government of laws and not of men. And so the Supreme Court decision on Social Security is very interesting indeed. Well, what are some of the proposed solutions to Social Security? One is made by Wilbur Cohen, who was for 22 years the head of, I guess you could call it public relations, marketing really with Social Security. And he is still around and being widely quoted as doing nothing at all, recommending we do nothing at all, we just kind of see what happens. I thought that was sort of interesting when he sees this impending disaster, and he is suggesting we simply wait and see what happens. He was talking something about, well, gee, any number of things could happen to alter the system. We could have 10 million more aliens come in and all of these things. And so I thought that was an interesting suggestion, but maybe he had something else in mind, and I'd like to raise the question in this way. While Wilbur Cohen, the number 2 man in Social Security for 22 years, was in Washington, he belonged to the Washington Committee for Aid to China, the Washington Committee for Democratic Action, and the Washington Bookshop Association, as well as being a member of the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action. I want to bring that to your attention because the first 3, at the time he was a member, those 3 organizations were on the Attorney General's subversive list as communist and subversive. So at that point I thought, well, gee, maybe there's more here than meets the eye. I wonder what Karl Marx had to say about Social Security. Well, I picked up and started reading the Communist Manifesto. This has got to be the most widely referred to and least read document in the 20th century in political theory. I thought it was how to make Molotov cocktails. And I wasn't into cocktail parties, and so I didn't need to know how to do any of that. But this is what Karl Marx at that time said. He said, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to wrest all capital from the owners." He said, "Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property, which will appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which outstrip themselves and necessitate further inroads upon the old social order." Isn't what he is saying what Wilbur Cohen perhaps had in mind, is that if we wait and do nothing to Social Security, Congress will be forced to use general revenues to bail the thing out. And of course, that's like in having a patient that's ill and inducing pneumonia to make him better somehow. Because, and I always smile whenever I hear this general revenues business. What general revenues? Tip O'Neill has suggested we fund the Social Security deficits out of general revenues. We hear this from the AFL-CIO and the Consumers Union. How are we going to do that? What general revenues do we have out there? As I understand it, Mr. Reagan is having his sweet time just trying to keep the deficit down to $42 billion, and without a lot of success, according to some other people who think it's going to be closer to $80 billion. So it's sort of like, as it seems to me, it's sort of like having two checking accounts, isn't it? Where they're both overdrawn, but you're going to cover the checks in one, the shorts in one by writing checks on the other. Isn't that neat? But you must know, by way of reference and sort of a refresher, that governments can only pay its bills three ways. One is through taxes, one is through borrowing, and the third way is simply creation of new money through the Federal Reserve System. For the skeptics in the crowd, and I hope we have some, I always try to say this at one time during a presentation or another, that I hope that you don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying in every respect. If you and I agree on everything we're covering tonight, then one of us is unnecessary. And the other part of it is that if you are skeptical of any of this, then you owe it to yourself to find out if any of this makes any sense. Because what if we're right? Well, the best way to find out about how the Fed creates new money is to go to the people who are doing it and asking them how it works. And back in 1959, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, Robert B. Anderson bluntly spelled out the techniques of inflation. He said, "Now suppose I wanted to write checks of $100 million starting tomorrow morning, but the Treasury was out of money. If I called up a bank and said, 'Will you loan me $100 million if I send you over a note to that effect?' The banker would probably say, 'Yes, I will.' Where would he get the $100 million we wish to credit to the account of the U.S. Treasury? Would he take it from the account of someone else? No, certainly not. He would merely create that much money by crediting our account in that sum and accepting the government's note as an asset. When I have finished writing checks for $100 million, the operation would have added that sum to the money supply." Unquote. Isn't that slick? How would you like to have a little machine like that in the basement? I mean, could $100 million tidy up a few bills at the house? Well, of course, when that new currency hits the old currency in the streets and starts to dilute it, the natural effect, of course, is rising prices. Some people call that inflation, but that's like saying that the wet streets cause the rain. The rising prices, it's a consequence, and we can talk a great deal about that. But here is a very good example of a newspaper article simply spelling it out very clearly for all to see. To meet the U.S. deficit, the Federal Reserve Board is going to expand the money supply, which is simply and has always been nothing but inflation. But while we're at it, I thought you'd like to know what the chairman said at the time. And at the time of this article, Chairman Arthur Burns said, today, the Federal Reserve will allow a moderate expansion of the country's money supply to meet heavy deficit spending by the federal government. But Burns said the Federal Reserve would not contribute to a new round of inflation. Isn't it amazing what they get away with? In fact, the quote is, "You can expect from the Federal Reserve System, as long as I'm there, that we will not release a new wave of inflation on this country." Isn't that fantastic? So the proper definition of inflation has been nothing more than the simple dictionary definition, which, according to the Random House Dictionary, is undue expansion or increase of the currency of a country, especially by the issuing of paper money not redeemable in gold. Do you think the politicians know about that? Do you have any doubt that they know? Well, here's William Proxmire. This is a part of an interview, actually, it's taken from the hearings on Social Security, from the Joint Economic Committee in 1976 that led to the largest tax increase in history. And he was asking Mr. Cardwell, an employee of the administration, Social Security Administration, how many checks were actually going out every month. And his answer was, today, between 32 and 34 million. Senator Proxmire, 32 to 34 million people. Almost all of them are voters. In my state, I figure there are 600,000 voters that receive Social Security. Can you imagine a senator under those circumstances saying, we are going to repudiate that higher proportion of the electorate? No. Furthermore, we have the capacity under the Constitution, the Congress does, to coin money as well as to regulate the value thereof. And therefore, we have the power to provide that money. And we are going to do it. It may not be worth anything when the recipient gets it, but he is going to get his benefits paid. So much for the guarantees and promises. And that's why the message that we've come to tell you, if you didn't know already, is that if you're not making other alternative plans, and prior to age 65, then now is the time. I'm not selling retirement plans, don't get me wrong. And of course, if you're one of the people in Paducah who are receiving checks and no way to get out, then we're going to talk about some other proposed solutions. But, you know, in my financial planning practice, it's about 9 times out of 10 that I hear people not asking, but telling me to plan on no Social Security for them and what other alternatives can we have. Well, what other alternatives, aside from expanding the money supply to do it, have there been? Well, there are several. And before we jump into that whole area, I'd like to suggest that what would happen to this country if, in fact, we did fund the deficits of Social Security through simply papering them over, much like doing over the bathroom with some new wallpaper. What would actually happen? By the way, the deficits are not insignificant. According to Mr. Robert Myers, again, my favorite actuary, who is old enough, by the way, I guess with age comes license to some degree. And this guy is, you know, beyond the point where he's trying to run for any kind of office. And so he is saying the deficit, according to him, the unfunded liability of Social Security is somewhere between 5 and 6 trillion. So it's an immense, almost inconceivably large amount of money. If we were to start papering over that kind of a hole in the boat, according to Barron's, the truth is that there is no such thing as a tolerable rate of inflation. Inflation amounts to a run in the fabric of society, something that is destroying the threads that tie one group to another. He said, no industrialized society in this century has been able to remain stable and free when inflation stayed above the 20% level. And of course, we can find quotes, and I will bury you in quotes if you could stand it, from people such as the chairman of the board of Latin America's largest business publishing company writing for Business Week, how inflation undermines morality. And so now the problem becomes a little larger, and now you can begin to see why the educational thrust of the John Birch Society and TRIM and other organizations like that are so important, because now we're talking about survival, and we're not simply talking about how do we cover a few short checks. Speaking of short checks, in my study of the system, I noticed in the law itself that they anticipated the fact that maybe the retirement funds would in fact be out of money one day, and when that happens, they won't be sending the checks. That's an alternative to sending them out and having them bounce. Now, the irony of that is, and the thing that struck me at the time, is that somebody had the foresight, or maybe anticipation, that in fact the Social Security system was going to one day go broke, the chickens would come home to roost, and this is how to solve that problem. Well, this is what Harvey Poppel had to say about the morality of inflation. And he said, I worry about it. I worry about it because I have seen with my own eyes that an inevitable consequence of an inflationary economy is an increasing concentration of political power, as more and more people are willing to accept less and less personal freedom in exchange for a little more order. Now, doesn't that sound a little bit like the prescription for the man on the white horse coming along and saying, I'll help you solve your problems if you just give me a little more power? By the way, history does not treat inflationary economies very well at all. I bring to you some bad news about the French assignat inflation in 1789 through 1794, leading to the rise of Napoleon, who solved the runaway inflation in France at that time by going on a gold standard, of course, long after he had become dictator. And what about the Pango inflation at the Second World War, after the Second World War in Hungary, leading to the collapse of society there and the easy installation of a communist government, which remains to this day? How about the runaway inflation of the Chinese money in 1949 that helped overthrow Chiang Kai-shek and install Mao Zedong? that lover of peace. And what about the most classic runaway inflation in history, the runaway inflation at the end of the First World War in Germany that led to the rise of Hitler? And so these, unfortunately, the liberals have a tiny problem explaining these things away because that is historical fact, and you can see time after time people attempting to warn us of that. Here is the editor of the London Times, the crisis of world inflation, and in one simple sentence he said, inflation has always had the same monetary causes and the same social consequence. There is no inflation which has not started with an increase in the supply of money, and no inflation which has not ended with the corruption of society. Well, may I suggest that there are only two kinds of societies, one in which we as individuals are free to do with our money and our efforts and our time as we wish, and another society in which we are not. And if we throw away one, what's left? And yet, all is not lost. There are some changes. I'd like to refer very quickly to what are called the Band-Aid approaches, and then we'll go to what I think is the best, really the only, but the best solution that is both moral and legal and will get us out of our mess. The Band-Aid approach, of course, is taken by politicians who are running for re-election, and the idea is to kick it under the rug until after the next election. And you'll see Representative Pickle and Claude Pepper and a few other people suggesting that we do the Band-Aid approach, which is allowing inter-fund borrowing, because there happens to be a temporary surplus in the Medicare fund and in the disability fund. And so if we allow little inter-fund borrowing, we can probably add 9 months to the estimate of survival of the system. I just saw an article in the paper today. I was given an article this evening, very briefly, that if we in fact borrow from the Medicare funds, what that'll do is move up the date that it will be insolvent from 1985 to 1983. So the whole thing is sort of, as a state of flux. The Band-Aid approach has also been suggested that we put back the retirement age from age 65 to age 68, that we reduce the rate of increase in the benefits. We use the consumer price index, but we take a couple of percentage off of it when we grant the new benefits. And, there is some mumbling about raising taxes even further. And some other people have said, well, why don't we avoid the double dippers? Why don't we get rid of the double dippers? Those are the people who are taking money out of the federal system. The one, by the way, that is functioning and is sound, this is if you're a government employee or if you're a congressman or a senator, their retirement fund is sound. Interesting. Again, the irony and the coincidence, we finally get to the point where the long arm of coincidence just plain can't reach this far. I can't imagine them being too concerned about our system when theirs is running along just fine. They are actually petrified of the idea that we would like to include them in our system. It's sort of the togetherness envisioned by the lion looking at the lamb, and he said, let's get together. And the lamb is saying, how did you have in mind? And you don't well know what he has in mind. So the Band-Aid approach isn't going to cut it. A few other people have said, well, why don't we get the felons off Social Security? Well, that was an interesting thing that I discovered. Do you know that we're paying Social Security payments to the son of Sam? In New York, he's now in jail for murder, but he is disabled, you see. And under the terms of Social Security, he's somehow able to get a disability benefit because he doesn't have all of his oars in the water, you see. We got to pay him a disability benefit, poor baby, $350 a month. There are more than 2,000 felons getting Social Security benefits, but we don't know who they are because they won't tell us what their Social Security numbers are. And so how about the group of some 400 families who are receiving some money from Social Security, living off on an island just off the coast of Greece? These are Greek families who have been to the United States. They're all related in some way, third and fourth nephews and uncles and nieces twice removed and all of that. And they've been to the United States just long enough to be covered, either currently or fully, under Social Security, and then they've retired. And the current status of that is that those 400 families are living on checks coming in on the Social Security administration at the rate of about $140,000 a month. I'm told that that's a very pleasant place to live, actually. Well, that is going to nibble away at the problem. The suggestions that if we take them all are going to save about $60 billion in Social Security. We're going to use that to solve a $5 trillion deficit. You see, it's sort of like whistling into the middle of a hurricane. And so here is maybe some good news about some of the alternatives available. I mean real alternatives. Here is a study that was done, a nationwide poll, and I'm quoting now from Human Events dated October 10th. 1981. You know, I'm asked occasionally, well, Adelmann, you want to make the thing voluntary? You want to abolish it? You want to let the people invest their own money or spend it or save it as they wish? And I say, yep. That's the only moral approach to this whole business. And, of course, it's allowed under the Constitution because all the power remains with the people except which is specifically given to the federal and state governments. And if they want to spend it and you would like to have your money and invest it, that's the, you know, it's all fits. You know, it makes some sense. People say, well, that's fine. Anybody with you? Anybody with you? A nationwide poll conducted by Sindlinger and Company suggests that public support is there for a real overhaul of Social Security. The poll conducted for the Heritage Foundation reveals that the public, by a nearly 2-to-1 margin, favors making participation in Social Security voluntary. 8 out of 10 Americans have little or no confidence in the financial stability of the Social Security system, and 2/3 of those surveyed consider private alternatives more efficient in providing retirement benefits. Now, the importance of that poll, in my opinion, can scarcely be overestimated. In my opinion, that is measuring what is called a sea change in attitude toward not only the Social Security system, but toward government itself. And so far as I'm concerned, that is what's going to turn this thing around, provided that we can get enough people to understand how to fix the system. Well, where is it being fixed? Can we use any specific examples? I was on a radio program not too long ago, and the fellow said, well, that sounds great, and I agree, and you can give me back my 6%, and I'll be happy just to get out of the system. You don't even have to pay me back what I've already paid in. But where are they doing it? Isn't the whole world going communist? And I said, ever heard of Chile? The look on his face was just something. I tell you, these people who read the media and stay up to date, when you ring the part of the memory bank that has nothing in it, why, the look on their faces sometimes is just awesome. Chile, he says. Chile, oh yeah. Isn't that in South America somewhere? I mean, it's awesome. What has happened is that the media blackout on Chile, ever since that anti-communist took over, has been absolutely almost complete. And we'll point out later, we've had our sweet trouble trying to find out exactly what's been happening. The very first time that we knew anything about what was happening in Chile was in a review of the news under "'Tis Passing Strange." And this is page 51 of the May 20th edition, 1981, talking about what happened in Chile. We've done a little more digging on it, and here's what's happened. In 1973, just before Allende was overthrown, the inflation in Chile was running 1,147% a year. Now, that's 100% a month. That's a doubling of every price about every 30 days. The Social Security system was taking 27% of everybody's check. Everybody was contributing, being taxed. 27% before they ever got paid anything. And the system itself was bankrupt. And General Pinochet came in and said, we are going to solve this problem by using the free market. He installed something that was later to be called Reaganomics, if you can believe that. He said, we are simply going to cut the size and the reach and the power of government by letting the free market do everything except the basic purpose of government, which is defense or negative, protection against enemies, domestic and foreign. And so he made the Social Security system private, and he got it out of the whole administration of government. In fact, it's spelled out right here. The author of this particular article says, more important to the Pinochet government than the effects on bosses and workers is the feature shifting the entire system into the private sector. Well, what has happened to Chile? What is going on in their economy? How is inflation doing now? Well, through the end of June of 1981, the inflation rate from a public point of view, from the consumer's level, is running a little less than 1% per month, down from 100%. And the producer's price index, or the wholesale price index is what we would call it here, is running a little over 0.1% increase per month. That is the lowest of any country reporting that statistic. How is the system doing? It's only taking 17%, and believe it or not, it's making a profit. In fact, not only that, the people who are putting money into that system are finding that they have a vested interest, they can measure what it's worth, and they can move it around. They have the privilege of moving it from one place to another if another place appears to be more attractive. And guess what that's doing? That is doing in the economy is creating competition for funds. And so he is using that old throwback to the Industrial Revolution, that old incentive called profit. And it's working. We have had our sweet time, as I told you before, trying to find out some really heavy-duty details about how the system actually works. we finally have gone to the Chilean consulate in L.A., and they have given us a copy of the entire Social Security law. It's 39 pages long, and it's all in Spanish. Well, so we're having it translated. For a while there, we were looking for somebody who was, bilingual or ambidextrous or trilateral or something, to do a number on it. But we finally have, and we should have that back shortly. So it is possible, and maybe this is the outline of how we might do it. There are several people who are proposing that basically we make the system optional for anybody over 50. For anybody who is retired, we make absolutely sure that those checks continue to come, however it takes to do that. Even though the system is immoral, it doesn't do any good for the little lady in Paducah who is building her life around that check and has no ability or flexibility to change. So it doesn't do any good to say that the system is immoral and adios. I just cannot see Mr. Reagan, for example, getting on television and saying, well, we have certainly appreciated your support over the last 45 years, and the system's gone, and thanks a lot. I just don't see that happening, and don't want it to happen. Making it perhaps optional for anybody over 50, and for anybody under 50, the answer will be it's on your own. You do with your money what you wish, and recognizing that there are a lot of incentives in the private market, and we've improved some of them perhaps. The IRA business maybe is a good example where everybody can now have their own. Perhaps increases other incentives. The All-Saver Certificate, that's an idea. Simply could be expanded so that contributions can be tax deductible, where for the first time in perhaps 15 years in this country, there is a substantial incentive to save. People are spending money in an inflationary economy simply because they are recognizing that the prices are going to go up next week, and so why keep the money? Let's get rid of it. And if we can reverse that psychology by simply saying, hey, it makes more sense to save some, then we can turn it around and simultaneously begin to build the capital base this country needs for the enormous expansion that's just waiting to be made, the rebuilding, if you will. And so while it's very idealistic, and I am idealistic, and I'm not a politician, I'm not running for anything, and so I'm giving it to you straight. This isn't, I'm not pulling any punches. There are some enormous difficulties. There are some advantages. One is that we would be at the forefront of the sea change in attitude. And secondly, for the very first time, the American people will know not only the lies of Social Security, but exactly how much money has been promised in total without being able to sweep it under the rug and ignore it anymore. Well, here is, I think, the best place to be motivated, because it's an idea which is working and has worked and is just simply getting better over time. And I refer to the efforts of people through the TRIM Committee of the John Birch Society. We're trying to put a TRIM committee in every single one of the 435 districts. If we are going to solve anything with this government, we're going to do it through the House of Representatives. Why? Well, one is they've got to come back to us every 2 years for their report card. And number two, that's where the money bills start. That's where the great big faucet is, the great big water valve, the money valve. And if we're going to have some influence, it's going to start right there. And here, I've been collecting these TRIM bulletins, by the way, over time throughout the country. There are some here from Wyoming and Southern California and Minnesota and Iowa. And, they're just all over the place, and they're just staffed by neat people. Here's the whole purpose of TRIM. It's just simply designed to let people know how he is doing. We're getting past the persiflage of how he looks and how he sounds and how he writes a letter. How is he voting when it comes time to vote, where the rubber meets the road? One way to tell, by the way, how effective TRIM has been is to measure the fact that the Democrat National Committee forced the Federal Election Commission to sue TRIM as being somehow political. And so therefore we had to register with them. It went to a 6-judge panel who unanimously threw the suit out, and the presiding judge wrote a strongly worded opinion in favor of TRIM and against the FEC, saying in essence, don't bother us with any more trivial suits like this. They are simply exercising their First Amendment rights, and so the Constitution still works. Well, how is TRIM working? Well, we have a couple of letters which I know you'd enjoy. We have a couple of very favorable ones from people in the House who have received TRIM bulletins from their TRIM chairman, and I know that you probably have seen letters like this, those of you who write to the members of Congress. And this is Bob Stump out of the 3rd District in Arizona. And he's writing to his TRIM chairman. He said, I'd like to commend you and the other members of the Arizona TRIM Committee for the information provided. I share in your goal of lower taxes through less government. We have another letter of similar nature from James Collins out of Texas and Robert Badham out of California. But we're not trying to reach those people. We're simply reminding them that we're out here looking and we appreciate what they're doing. The other people are those who rather like, you know, if you throw a stone into a pig pen, the one that squeals is the one you hit. Well, we have a couple of pigs. Actually, here's Richard Nolan. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Grunke, I appreciated your taking the time to write to me to express your concerns regarding my voting record. I am afraid, however, that the trim bulletin that you have sent to me is one of the most terrible examples of a slanted and misleading newsletter. The John Birch Society does our great country no good by publishing such junk. By the way, where do these votes come from? The congressional record. Who slants the congressional record but the people who are doing the voting? The people we're interested in is people like Berkeley Bedell, who in fact is saying one thing and doing another. Here is a letter that we've gotten hold of. This was written in February of 1981. And he's writing to his trim chairman. He said, I share the public frustration over high taxes and the growing need for American businesses and individuals to increase their investments to stimulate economic growth. Who does that sound like? Doesn't that sound like David Stockman and Arthur Laffer and the OMB and Ronald Reagan and supply-side economics? Well, of course it does. That's what it sounds like to me. How's his voting record? Well, in the previous 3 trim bulletins in his area, he was voting about 20% as for lower taxes. He was running about 80% in favor of more government spending, more intervention. And so he reminded me of that fellow who was caught necking the maid in the kitchen by his wife. And he turned to her and he said, all right, what are you going to do? Are you going to believe me or are you going to believe what you saw? Huh? That's all that trim is designed to do. That's all it is designed to do. It's just keep an eye on these guys when they're in the kitchen. Here's a letter written from Jim Weaver back in 1976, just as the trim committee in his district was getting started. And he was really unhappy with what trim showed at the time. In fact, so unhappy is he that he wrote a little note at the bottom of the letter saying to his trim chairman, great little bulletin, that trim. It reminded me of a common substance found in barnyards. Well, that galvanized the trim committee into action, believe me. And a couple of years later, this letter was written to Mr. Weaver by the trim chairman. My heartiest congratulations to you. The enclosed trim bulletin showing your vote on 10 issues is solidly behind the much-needed push to cut down the size of government. And Mr. Weaver responded with another letter, which this one says, Dear Bill, I appreciate getting the trim bulletin. As you know, I have strongly supported cutting the waste and fat out of the federal budget, and I have voted against most appropriation bills, including HEW and foreign aid. Well, they wrote to him again and said, Dear Mr. Weaver, congratulations. I follow the Southern Oregon Trim Committee quite closely, and it'll be a real pleasure to be putting out their winter bulletin showing your terrific voting record for less government and lower taxes. And he wrote back, and this time along the bottom of his letter, he wrote, Thanks, Bill. See, Mr. Weaver is, those are the people we're addressing in this issue. He is called a mugwump. A mugwump, as you well know, is an individual who sits on the fence with his mug on one side and his wump on the other. They kind of vote like windshield wipers. I mean, it's sort of just like this. Sort of whoever they talk to just before the roll call is how they get the vote. I think maybe Larry McDonald's example is even better. Do you remember back in grade school when you were given some iron filings and a magnet? You do remember that. I mean, everybody here is young enough to know that. And I remember particularly we were given a piece of paper and we put the iron filings on top of the paper and we took the magnet underneath, you know, and make all these funny designs. And the iron filings would tend to collect around the North and the South Pole of the magnet. Well, McDonald said that essentially is what's happening politically in the House of Representatives. And he said there is one pole which is the Americanist contingent. And these are the people who are fiscally responsible, the Americanist, limited government, pro-constitution, and so on. And their influence is over here. And way over here on the other side are the influence of the communists and those who are working diligently and knowledgeably and willingly to destroy the republic. And their numbers are relatively small. And there's about 300 in the middle who sort of vote like Mr. Weaver. And MacDonald goes on to say that if we, in fact, can increase the influence of the Americanist contingent a little and reduce the influence of the pro-communist and totalitarian influence a little, then gradually over time, the other 300, for preservation's sake. Remember, the definition of a politician is that who is somebody who is most interested only in getting reelected. If we somehow can get them moving in the direction toward less government, more individual responsibility, then with God's help we will have a better world. And that's all we're doing. So I invite you, with such time, effort, influence, and money as you may have. Those are the gifts that Paul was spelling out, as you know, in the New Testament, in his letter to the church in Corinth, of the gifts that each of us has. Time, effort, influence, money. And in this fight, some of us have more than one. All of us have one, at least. And a few of us have all four. As business people, we may not have the time and the effort, but we certainly would have the influence, and perhaps we have enough money through the successful operation of our business to invest in our business and making sure that the climate is there. You know, that's one of the reasons somebody asked me why I do this insane thing. Is it the money? Go around the country and leave my business, which, as you can well imagine, tends to become unraveled a little bit. My business is rather like stringing beads on a string that doesn't have a knot in it. You know, it's just a continuous process. And when I'm not there, why, we lose some beads. Do I do this for that? And I said, no, really, fundamentally, the reason that I personally do this is that there aren't any investment advisors in Cuba. There aren't any insurance salesmen in Russia. I mean, we haven't got any real estate moving real well in Red China right now. And, of course, if we become totalitarian, why, it's going to be awfully hard to make a living. And so I do it for a very selfish reason. I also happen to have 4 children, one of each, and I want to make sure that the system is there for them. So, very selfish reasons. Some of us have money, in which case we say, gee, join the trim committee and help us fund the thing. And when the trim chairman comes to visit you, I say, I don't have the time or the effort, and I may not have the influence, but I'll give you $100 a quarter. Modest investment to save the whole thing. We only need a few. I want to talk with you about what happened in Lexington. I was up in Concord, Massachusetts, visiting my sister-in-law, and I had a chance to go to a little museum there, right by the bridge, you know, where the shot was fired, heard around the world, and started this whole marvelous experiment. And I went there, and I read the little plaque, and I saw the hill where the Americans were waiting for the British. And there were about 1,500 Americans, about 1,200 British as they were coming down the road. And I remember the poem, the 18th of April, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, hardly a man is now alive, remembers that famous day and year. And, of course, you know that the poet did take some historical liberties by saying that Paul Revere, in fact, had made it all the way to Concord, and he did not. He was arrested part way between Lexington and Concord. You also remember the reason where the British were going was that they had learned that there were a great amount of arms and munitions and powder buried in a farmer's field in Concord, and they wanted to nip this insurrection in the bud. So you could safely say that the first incident had to do with gun control. And this is all refresher course for you, I'm sure. In this little museum, I learned something about the people in Lexington, and what I learned was that there were about 1,300 people who lived there at the time. Approximately. It was hardly a town. You could call it a township, with basically a dirt road through the center. Now, Paul Revere rode through the town. It was the 17th of April, and he rode through the town trying to get people to up and to arms, and the British are coming, and so on. Now, of course, the British at this point represented the largest and most awesome collection of military power in the world. And there were 1,200 redcoats heading into a town of 1,300 people. My question to you is, how many got themselves out of bed to meet them? Across the little dirt road right in front, right in the little square of Lexington. How many people? Do you have any idea at all? Well, we know exactly how many, because in Rebels and Redcoats, a book that I commend to you, a collection of writings of both the British and the American soldiers during the Revolutionary War, a fascinating study, we know exactly how many because they counted noses to find out how many people were there. There were 38. 19 of them were shot. 10 of them died that day. One of them died as he was crawling up the front stoop of his house into the front door looking for safety as his wife opened the door to find out what all the shooting was about. And he died right there. 38. Now my question to you is, what happened to all the rest of them? Well, some of them probably never got the message. Some of them got the message and didn't do anything about it. But my point of this story is that the 38 was enough. Because by the time the 1,200 men contingent of the British Army reached the bridge at Concord, there were 1,500 Americans. And that was the start of this marvelous experiment. And so we don't need to reach 235 million people, but we need to reach everybody who has heard the warning. And so you can no longer leave perhaps a meeting like this saying, I don't know what's going on in this country. I don't understand, and so therefore I'm not responsible. Reminds me of these two guys on a ship. One came running up to the other one in a great tither, and he said, Charlie, Charlie, this ship is sinking, this ship is sinking. And his friend said, well, let her go, it ain't ours. Well, it is yours if you're on it. Here's a scientific fact about a ship. You can't sink half of one. And just go on with the cruise. It all stays up, or it all goes down with all the people on it all together. And, once that's the first order of business, it seems to me, is keep the ship afloat. And then we worry about who's going to be the captain, who's going to be the first mate, and what the fringe benefits will be, and where we're going to go, and how fast, and so on. But we got to keep the ship afloat. And that's the first order of business. And so I do see that we have just about run our course. And I hope that this information has been helpful to you and motivational to you. And now I want to tell you finally, from my heart, how grateful I am to each of you for coming here tonight and listening to what we have to say. I appreciate each of you. God bless you all. Thank you.